Welcome to the Audiation in the Wild podcast with your hosts, Bo Talifer and Eric Rasmussen. Episode 9, The Hierarchy of Tonal Learning Sequence, an investigative conversation. This is a good one. Hope you enjoy it. If you'd like to leave us a comment, email us at teachmusictokids@gmail.com, and you can leave a voicemail at teachmusictokids.com. Thank you and enjoy.
Okay, so we were having a interesting conversation about the hierarchies in the tonal learning sequence. So we have this hierarchy of tonality, functions, harmonic functions, and tones, and they can all have. I would say they all have a verbal associate. So the tonality has a verbal associate called major or minor. And I'm aware this isn't necessarily lining up with everything Gordon said, but I think once we get around to this, I think he would have been on board with this. And I think in certain contexts, it makes a lot of sense. So we can have a verbal associate that labels the whole tonality. And then we have the harmonic functions. And Eric, this is where your work comes in, because you, I think, correctly identified that you can learn to recognize and audiate and label harmonic functions without labeling any individual tones. So I don't need to label the tones as C, E, G, or Do, Mi, So. I can know that this is a one chord by hearing it in the context of a song. And your harmonic learning sequence has, I think, proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that is correct. But mostly what's done in verbal association for the tonal context is you label individual tones of harmonic functions. So you label, for one, Do, Mi, So, and so on. And then they kind of just tell you like, oh, whenever you hear Do, Mi, So, that's a one chord. But the way you're going about it is totally reverse. You're teaching people how to identify the whole gestalt of the one chord as harmony in a song, and then later they're given the tonal patterns to sing. That's correct, right?
The way I do it, yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is you can add another layer to this. You can teach them to identify the tonality at large without the other verbal associates. So usually what people do is they say, resting tone Do is major. Resting tone La is minor, and then you go through partial synthesis, and then partial synthesis at least gets you to the point where they can, you can listen to a familiar song, and you can tell if it's in major or minor tonality. That would be the most commonly done first stage of partial synthesis. But the way you answer the question is by telling the person, well, I hear La as the resting tone, so I know it's minor, or I hear Do as the resting tone, so I know it's major. But what I'm saying is you don't actually need to do that to teach somebody how to hear the difference between major and minor. And this comes back to, all I did was I did the same thing that you did with the harmonic functions, but I'll just play a familiar song in major, usually Twinkle, because that's the most familiar song, I think, right? And I have had, so we're in February right now of 2022. I had a bunch of students that started with me in September, and they could do this within a few lessons. But you play them a familiar song, and then you play the same song in minor, and you explicitly tell them that something changed. You just tell them like, well, that's not right. That's the wrong one. That's the different one. And after you play around with this for a while, you just start asking them, you just play them one of the songs. You say, which one was that? Was that the regular Twinkle, or was that the new Twinkle? And then after they get the answer right, and you know that they're inductively aware of what you're talking about. So the reason I use that word is that you showed them by examples, right? I said, this is the regular Twinkle. This is the new Twinkle. Then after they keep getting that right with like a high degree of certainty, I just teach them the regular Twinkle is in major. The other Twinkle is in minor. And then I redo it, but make them use the proper name, major and minor. But what's really interesting about this is that at this point, they can now tell me the tonality of a song, and they have no idea what a resting tone is. They have no idea what any verbal associates are, whether pitch letters or solfege names, and they have no idea how to label any functions. And so what I found is that once you do this with enough songs, you do a few familiar songs, and you teach them to label the difference between major and minor, you can now give them a new song that they've never heard before and ask them, is this major or minor? And they will bang get it right. They will just know it's major. And so it's really interesting because it shows that there are different types of verbal associates in harmony. The only normally we consider verbal associate to be attached to individual tones, and if not, usually that's with a harmonic function. So where we're singing the tones of a harmonic function. But I think there are other kinds of verbal associates, and it begs the question: is it useful? Because what I've said, I have no doubt that it works. You can do that. But the real question is it useful to someone to know the name of a tonality in context before they start learning the more granular verbal associates? And I don't think I have the answer to that, and I'm not sure anyone does. But from what I've seen so far, is like, someone's been taking piano lessons with me for a couple months. I can start using the words major and minor all the time, and they know what I'm talking about through their audiation, and it's proved to be very useful.
I'm saying, so I want to poke holes a little bit in what you're saying.
Sure.
Your version of partial synthesis, as you expressed it, may not align at all with the learning sequences put out in, learning sequences music in the, capital MLT world.
I agree, because the point of partial synthesis...
But you're talking about making comparisons, which is what's at the heart of partial synthesis.
But so what I'm saying is that normally partial synthesis is defined in the tonal learning sequence as you're synthesizing the verbal associate of the familiar harmonic patterns that are given solfege syllables. And then later on, you're taught that, well, if you sang do mi so, we call that a one chorded major, right? But that's kind of glossed over in my mind, and I think your work points to that as well. Is that just singing the tonal patterns isn't the same as what you're doing with the harmonic learning sequence activities, right? Like just doing verbal association and partial synthesis is not the same as playing the yes/no game and learning to hear the functions as unified gestalts. Is different.
No, we're collapsing those first three learning sequence activities: the oral, the verbal association, and the partial synthesis. By showing differences.
Sure. So that if you grant me for just one moment the fact that labeling a tonality without solfege at all is a type of verbal associate, because you're verbally associating a label with some kind of thing in your audiation. It's not as granular as an individual solfege syllable, but I think it has merit because you still have to follow the sequence. You have to start with a familiar song, and I only use Twinkle because most kids already have that in their listening vocabulary before I start doing it. And then I need something to compare it to. So I start playing them the minor Twinkle, and I'm not doing anything other than it's just oral. Now I could make them sing it back to me and play it, and I often do that with students. They'll learn how to play the minor version before I even label it as minor. And then I will start I'll introduce the label after I know that they can discriminate between the two. And so it functions very much in the same way that the learning sequence activities function. It goes through this period of oral, and I consider rote playing on an instrument to be part of that experience for instrumentalists. And then it goes through, you're giving them a verbal associate it's there, but it's a little shaky, right? It's like, this is major, this is minor, no quiz yet. And then all the partial synthesis is does this sound like major, which was the original Twinkle, or does it sound like minor, which was the other Twinkle we've been doing? And what's interesting is that if you do this with enough familiar songs, they seem to develop the ability by inference to give you the word major or minor with a new untrained song. So it even has this like ability to generalize or on top of it. But I do acknowledge that that's not the way that verbal associates are used in MLT normally. But I think it is a valid use of what a tonality is.
We're using a song instead of a tonal pattern to compare another song to, and they're the same song except the tonality's changed. So that's one thing.
For sure.
So we're using a holistic approach is like, okay, just listen to the song you already know. You don't need to learn tonal patterns. You don't need to learn tonality. You don't need to learn the functions to be able to do that. It goes to the what's in my book, do you want it the right way or the wrong way? Do you want it to sound like this or this, 151 in minor? Do you want it to sound like 151 in major? Do you want it to sound like this in minor? Or do you want resting tone do? Do you want resting tone la? Right? Do you want the right resting tone, the wrong resting tone? This way or that way?
Yeah.
The right way or the wrong way is another way I get at it. Then, or do you want it in major or minor? That's how I develop up to major or minor.
Yeah.
Through the use of the resting tones first. But the way you're doing it, if a student gets it right off the bat and you've got tremendous success doing it exactly that shortcut way, see, now you're advancing. You're teaching to their music aptitudes. They're able to get it right away. They're intuiting, or not necessarily intuiting, but they're generalizing. Oh, that's major, that's minor. I'm able to make that distinction now that you're playing an unfamiliar song.
And in my experience, what's really interesting is they don't seem to be able to generalize unless you do it with enough familiar songs. So like if you just if you just did it once with Twinkle and then ask them, is this other song in major? They're just still tossing a coin. You have to do it multiple times with a few familiar songs.
Yeah. And so what I'll suggest is that eventually you're going to run into a kid who won't be able to generalize that major minor the way you've done it.
Sure.
The way you've done it's brilliant for that kid, and most of your kids are able to do it, because I bet the kids come to you, generally with higher music aptitude than like if you went into a school of 30 kids in a class. You're going to have some degree of failure.
Well, and I'm a private music teacher, right? So most people seeking out private music lessons, the kids have been asking for them. That's often the story that the parents tells me.
So there's a drive, and the drive probably comes as a result also one component or serious component of that, not only the intrinsic motivation that the student has, but also their aptitude. Right? And their aptitude and intrinsic motivation probably go together a little bit, although I have students with high motivation don't necessarily have high music aptitude.
I have some of the opposite too.
Right? Oh yeah.
Which is very interesting.
Yeah, the kids that don't practice, but they come in and they blow you out of the water with their lessons. So if they're not able to make that generalization with an unfamiliar song, is this major or minor? Does this sound like the right way Twinkle should go or the wrong way Twinkle should go? Or however you do it. If you're labeling, you're already adding the verbal associate, which is actually, there's verbal associates for tones, like, do, mi, so, and then there's verbal associates for tonalities, which we call labels.
Okay, so that's a label. So
it's a label, and right, so there's just two kinds of verbal associates, like tonic dominant are labels, tones and rhythms, the syllables are a different kind of verbal associate, just to replace the experience of the sound itself.
Which is interesting because the verbal associate for individual tones, which is the syllable, they're very specific, right? So. But the verbal associate for the harmonic functions,
they're specific inside a tonality and more specific inside the tonality inside the function.
Yeah. But they're specific once you're in a tonality in the function. The verbal associate for the individual tones are as specific as you can get. The label for the harmonic functions is in a sense more holistic, because any arrangement of these tones, even extensions, you could play a major 9 chord, it could be your 1 chord. It still has the same harmonic label, 1, right? So and even let's say you were just going to do a triad, just do, mi, so in major. That could be in any arrangement. That arrangement could have a bunch of does, a few does. It could be in different versions, how musicians often think of that. So the harmonic label is super. It's less tied down. It's more open to all these. It has more information that it covers. The label covers a lot of information for the harmonic functions. because of all these things. And this is why in your own teaching, when you do the yes no game, you don't play the same voicings every time. That would actually be a hindrance to teaching them the label of the functions. You want to play many different voicings of the same functions when you're doing the yes no game, because then there's some awareness. Well, Eric's not just talking about this 5 chord that he keeps playing in his left hand every time I do the lesson. We're gonna put the root in the bass just to cut down some of the complexity. But what I'm getting at is that the harmonic functions.
Yeah, the root's always in the bass.
Sure. But everything else is up for grabs. But then the tonality, and we've had some really interesting conversations about this. People often get very confused about, the label tonality is very wide because, for example, you could be a major but play a bunch of tones and functions that don't come out of the very vanilla major, and you haven't left major necessarily. There are some songs that are actually multi-tonal, but more often than not, bebop's a great example. The songs are just in major, and they just use other functions, So there's some ability that people have to just infer tonality without the specifics of even the harmony can get a little adventurous, and you haven't left the tonality necessarily. But
if you're strong enough aptitude, you can keep that resting tone throughout a song that's even modulated for a phrase.
I mean, we've talked about that recently. That's been more my experience lately with these secondary dominants. It feels like the resting tone just stays pinned in my mind now. There's no where before it'd be more up for grabs. But one of the most practical benefits I see in actually doing this with students, and this is the whole reason I was going to bring it up, is that I noticed when you're teaching students instrumentally, especially on the guitar and piano, because when you're teaching them by rote, which you have to do if you're gonna do anything that lines up with oral, teaching instrumental students by rote is just the way to go. They will rely on the guitar and the piano are very visual instruments. It's such a useful shorthand when you're teaching someone how to play a song from major to minor, minor to major. Don't use relative tonalities. Keep the tonality parallel. And I'm not saying forever, but I'm saying in a lot of situations, you do Mary Had a Little Lamb in the keyality of C in major and minor. They barely have to change anything they play. And so what I started noticing is if before I get into verbal associates, I get them to play these songs by rote, at least I have a label I can use. So for example, if I have a student who can play a bunch of folk songs in major and minor by rote in these parallel tonalities, they're not at the point yet where I'm doing tonal patterns with them and all that kind of stuff. But I can say, hey, play the major twinkle. Hey, play the minor twinkle. And I can reverse it. Which one did I just play? Did I play the major or minor? And it's really cool that they can do that. And it serves a very, in my mind, very practical purpose because they're not out to lunch. They know what you're talking about. But yeah, I definitely acknowledge, this is something that I've been playing around with more over the past year, especially.
So before we started recording,
we
were talking about this hierarchy, which was kind of you brought it, but there was a point that I wanted to get at with you. It's so you're saying you're teaching tonality in that way, and it comes before functions.
Sure.
I'm teaching functions sometimes before tonality, and they go hand in hand. So you can do tonality before functions, or functions before tonality.
Well, I'm doing both too, right? I'm doing the harmonic learning sequence with pretty much all my students. Some of them, some of them I'm not doing with for other reasons, but I am doing both.
Yeah. And you can do. I don't have any problem with what you're doing, as long as they've got the experience, the oral of the functions, right, and the oral of the tonality, the right way, wrong way, that comparison. Then comes the tonal patterns or individual tones inside those tonal patterns. Right? So now you could teach those tonal patterns to get at functions, and those tonal patterns first to get at tonality. or right, you could put those first,
But
and
think of
that's
it, if we did it the way we're talking about, so they learn to sing and play or play their instruments by rote, and they learn to label tonality very early on, and they're also learning to label functions. By the time you start doing tonal patterns with them, I feel like it's a lot easier for them in a certain sense because they already know what major and minor sound like, and they already know what these functions sound like. And then you start
see,
getting them to label tonal patterns, and they're like, "Oh,
yeah,
well, in major, the one chord is do mi so because I already
that's
know what major is, and I already know what the one chord is. So now I know the even more granular label." Instead of going the other way around, you start with a really granular label. You say, "Okay, now I know do mi so, and I know this is a one chord because it's do mi so, and I know this is major because it's a one chord and it's do mi so." It's a lot. It's so backwards,
and it takes too long. That's
and you're
number
not starting
one.
with context, right? If you start with context,
Well, you are, because you're establishing tonality before you sing tonal patterns, but you're not.
well, you're starting in context in terms of, yeah, that way, starting in context in their audiation. You're not just singing total patterns to them without actually doing an oral context that their audiation can grab onto. But what I'm saying is, we're actually, if you do it this way, where you do tonality and function before getting into labeling individual tonal patterns, you're really starting with their understanding of context. Like when they're labeling things, they're labeling the context specific things before the very granular solfege syllables. Um,
Yep.
and I mean, I think, I don't think there's a point to say should we do the game that I'm saying or harmonic learning sequence first. Just do both at the same time. If you had to hold a gun to my head, I'd do the harmonic learning sequence because it's less likely they're going to get that from anyone else.
Yeah.
But definitely seems useful because if the first time your students start hearing, um, I mean, major and minor, you can teach major and minor through the standard partial synthesis after they know the solfege syllables and
Well,
all that.
it's actually adverbal association.
Yeah, yeah. But it's an interesting finding that you don't need to go all through all that other stuff for them to actually learn to recognize it through induction, which is the whole reason I started doing this. We were talking about induction a lot last year, but induction is the method that you use when you're teaching any concept that has to be learned through the sensory realm, which is often with young kids. And music is, audiation has to come through. It's a very specific aural based phenomenon. Induction works so well, but this kind of ties into what we were talking about the last couple episodes about aptitude, is that the game that I'm doing is essentially hinging on your aptitude in a large degree, but it's also hinged on how well you know the song. Because I've had once in a while I get a student who doesn't know Twinkle that well, and you can't show them the difference as quickly. I mean, this is resting on the fact that most kids in Western culture know that song like the back of their hand, and after you sing it for a couple classes to them and do the minor one, they pick it up really fast. But if they don't know the song that well, it's really hard to get the same results as fast. And I'll try to do it through another song if possible. But no, it's really interesting for sure.
So these tonal patterns, we're not. So I want to be completely 1,000% clear. Are so freaking valuable.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes,
Right. Um, and teaching those tonal patterns, without solfege, right, help to develop a sense of tonality. Absolutely.
sure.
All we're saying is tonality can be understood without those in most students or some students, and we need to research.
I would love to research that
Um,
because in my experience, it's been all my students. I don't have students that can't
this,
do that.
this is where we beg for money. Any of the
If the
millionaires
song
out
is
there.
familiar enough and you roll out the learning activity in the proper way where they can sing the song and play the song by rote on their instrument, and also you give them a lot of chances where I might even for a week do the game without making them on the spot. I'll play the major one, I'll play the minor one, and I'll ask myself, was like, how do I know which one that is? Oh yeah, this one sounds like the regular twinkle, so I know that's major. I might even give that as an
Yeah.
example before I start putting them on
Yeah.
the spot with it.
So I was extraordinarily successful teaching functions, but I never stopped teaching tonal patterns. At some point,
Sure.
I did less tonal pattern instruction, and the functions were still easily learned. And then we've mentioned several times in our conversations
Mm-hmm.
that the reason the tonal patterns are the way they are is because they're based in what? Functions. Functions give rise to tonal patterns, not the other way around.
Sure.
So you can, and I put my foot down to say, if you can audiate the functions and understand this is not where it ends, this is where it ends. This is dominant, this is tonic, but without saying the words, just yes, no. Does it end here? No. Does it end here?
So that's the
yes.
induction. You're making sure they can understand the concept in their own experience before you give it labels.
Yeah, and so if you can do that, then tonal patterns are much easier to audiate because you already have an understanding of the functions in a more of a gestalt, more of a right.
Totally. And the only thing I'm poking at here, the main thing I'm poking at is that usually the way the learning sequence unfolds is we teach the verbal associates, the solfege verbal associates for the tonal patterns, and then we try to reverse engineer the awareness of the function, which is what you've shown doesn't work as well as what you're doing. Like, just because you teach someone to sing do mi so and this is major and you do partial synthesis, it's not the same as the harmonic learning sequence activity stuff. Hearing the function gestalt and recognizing it is a separate like psychic phenomenon. They're totally different from each other.
If a student can't hear the differences, you got to go back to what's most basic in terms of developing a vocabulary. Is you got to teach them these words, and the words are the tonal patterns.
Sure.
You know what I mean? It's like it's underpinning, but we don't need to develop that underpinning necessarily to get more advanced achievement in terms of understanding, this hierarchy of tonal audiation.
Sure.
To be able to audiate functions, to audiate tonality, you don't need individual tonal patterns to do that, unless you do, unless there's a student that right. So.
Well, really,
and I'm just trying to get shortcut because music learning theory and learning sequence activities, if we do them the way they're mapped out officially, in the Jump Right In curriculum or any curriculum that uses them or that's been established, it's just too slow. You can't get to enough.
It is too slow.
Quick enough to get to the point where you're adding extra tones to chords, like we demonstrated in a previous, maybe the last podcast.
But I mean, let's tip our hat where it's worth it. Like, the difference between students leaving grade 7 that can truly audiate 1-4-5 and other students who can't do that, who are not exposed to MLT, like we're in different universes here. But what we're saying is there is this subset of people who seem to audiate really, really well. And yeah, you can say it's their aptitude and all that, but they learn to audiate a ton of functions in a way that if you followed the MLT curriculum where you unroll all this stuff in the tonal learning sequence, all the tonalities, all the functions, it take most people forever to get to the end of that, whether or not your aptitude is high enough or not. There's got to be a faster way to do some of this stuff.
Yeah, I don't even get to Lydian and Phrygian unless I've had the kids for 2 or 3 years, because I'm so much more interested in getting them to understand dominant of the submedian in major, because it's just so much more in there.
That is a much more useful skill. I will go to, I love tonal, like, music in different tonalities. I grew up playing a lot of it, which probably helped me a lot. But if you're talking about, would I rather my students know Lydian and Phrygian or a ton of functions in major and minor? It's not even a question in my mind, because that is
Yeah.
way more useful in our society.
Well, you and I have an agenda to make more jazz musicians in the world.
Sure, sure. Yeah.
And if you're going to be a jazz musician, you got to play the 200 tunes from the 20s to the
But at a
80s.
certain point, all this stuff it gets silly, because, like, what's the defining functions in Phrygian? It's the 7 and the 2. There's other things too. There's the 4, but I'm thinking the 2 chord is like a big
Yeah.
deal, right? It's not happening anywhere else. But that function happens in jazz tunes in major tonality.
Yeah.
The flat 2. I'm going to say flat 2.
Yeah, but if you have but here's the thing where I'll go is that I'll flip when I hear, a flat 2 to tonic, even if it's a major tonic, that flat 2 could sound, like the 2 in Phrygian, and it's just the Phrygian is got a major tonic this time.
Yeah.
And making those comparisons audiationally, like just an F chord to an E chord,
Sure.
just F to E. If you know Phrygian in major, when you have an F chord to an E chord, if you're in E major, that or anywhere, any place you have an F chord to E chord,
that's what I was gonna
say. You could map over
every
any
resting
number
tone possible over F to E.
It could be, that could be fa mi, that could be ra do, it could be anything.
Yeah. Which some are more useful than others, but this gets to another point that it's very interesting, because if you look at all the tonalities and all of the secondary dominants, and I'm talking about the main tonal learning content in an MLT curriculum, like a very mapped out one. We have all the tonalities, all their essential functions. We have a lot of secondary dominants in major and minor. We might have the minor 4 chord in major. Those are like the standard ones that people will learn if they go all the way. But there's a lot of other functions. There's other things, like Green Dolphin Street. 1 flat 3, 2 flat 2, and they're all major chords, right?
Yeah.
And so I think probably the most important thing, as always, is the listening vocabulary. But this is why there's no doubt in my mind why, when people start hanging out with jazz musicians, does their tonal aptitude or achievement seem to skyrocket. It's probably just because they're being exposed to so much stuff. Like, who's playing all these functions? Not in with the MLT curriculum, typically not, but I think it should be in more listening vocabularies. There's a lot of other functions. There's a lot of very odd things out there that people don't get exposed to.
Yeah, but let's just start with the typical functions. Even in a Pat Metheny tune, there's some odd inversions or some bass notes or some extra chord tones, say, but basically it's all typical bebop or easier changes.
Sure, yeah.
And so anytime you have a tune, so what he goes through to warm up, before he plays a concert, is he just arpeggiates, every chord in the tune, do da dee dee, do da dee dee, whatever the chord changes are, he arpeggiates them, and then they basically get his fingers going, but it's not.
Well, just as a sidebar, this is what's going on. The jazz community is literally using tonal patterns. What they will do is they'll play only chord tones over every function in the song, and you do that so much that you really, it's like doing familiar pattern in familiar order. It's the same phenomenon.
Right. There's 2 things going on, right?
Yeah.
First is that you play all the chords arpeggiated throughout the tune, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you go back and then you play a melody note that has good voice leading. So
Totally.
What's the closest or the next closest tone that works inside and only play tones that are appropriate to the chord, or they're actually in the chord.
There's a more extreme example of that too. Like if you're in the keyality of C and you're in major, can you play just a G note and hear every other function in the song underneath it, and just keep the G pin there, no matter what comes? Songs that I'm very familiar with, I'm comfortable with that. But songs that I'm not as familiar with, that's harder. That's another. I think that's another direction it can go. But it's no doubt fascinating that in my mind, I figure why not do all of it? Why not do the harmonic learning sequence? Why not do this labeling of tonalities? Because we don't have research, so we don't really know.
All of it except note names.
Well, I mean, I don't know if we've released that episode, but I'm gonna go to bat for the note names more than most people would. There are certain contexts where and this is sacrilege, where pitch letters are surprisingly useful.
Yeah, but we go through that conversation. We'll put it out before or after this. People are we have no order in these conversations.
And just as a sidebar to the rest of the conversation, and just to touch on this more, I do believe there are certain situations where pitch letters on their own or in tandem with movable do serve a more useful purpose in certain musical contexts.
If you've had enough oral, verbal association, tonality saturation, and chord function saturation.
Yeah, which I had all that before I started. Before I started using that, and
so there's a point at which note names become more valuable sooner than Gordon might have considered.
Yeah, and my only defense of that, well, I have a couple. One is in the research. The research was not done. The research on movable do with a law bass minor was done to see how did this affect people's aptitudes and ability to achieve and audiate. But he wasn't pushing this into the realm of bebop. Right. So no. So my kind of observational data to back up what I'm saying, and you can always throw the aptitude card at this, is that the musical community that exists today, with probably the highest level of audiators, which is the jazz community, almost exclusively uses pitch letter as verbal associates. And I'm convinced they are using them as verbal associates because they can do the things that we ask our MLT students to do. They can notationally audiate the functions with the verbal associates. They can improvise with them. They can, it's not just decoding with pitch letter names. I'm talking about they can use the pitch letter name in the same way.
So maybe all those people have enough high aptitude that they, they're getting the hardcore basics, are oral.
And that's another thing in the jazz
community. Then they go right to generalization. Sure. And then now they're going right to theoretical understanding. And pitch letters don't affect. See, pitch letters are only a problem, I think, in the Gordon world when they're detached from the context. And your pitch letters is because they already understand these changes, or they already understand this tonality. And better yet, they understand the changes inside the tonality.
Sure.
Or the tonality because of the changes. And then they're audiating what A7 is, no matter what the context is.
Totally.
Right, because an A7 could be in B flat major, right? It's just weird, but it's the dominant of the three, right? So
it's surprisingly common. It's surprisingly.
I know, that's why
common.
I brought it up. But it's a weird, it's the one that's supposed to be on the local.
The Beatles use it too, right? It's in Beatles tunes too, which is, that's scarier in a way that. But no. I think the real, and we talk about this at more length, I think the real issue with using pitch letters as verbal associates in the skill learning sequence is that, especially if you're an instrumental teacher, your students only have so much working memory. So if they're just learning to play music, are you going to fill it up with a bunch of verbal associates that they don't need? Or are you going to focus it on the oral stuff? And I think you could really have the same problem that you could use movable do with a law bass minor at an inappropriate stage. If someone's at oral and you try to label everything, it's not a useful thing to do at that point in time. But we'll come back to that, and I'd like to dedicate a longer period of time to that conversation, because we've been talking about this for a while, and I think I think it's actually an important conversation for the MLT community to have, especially when we have MLT teachers interacting with really high level jazz musicians, saying things like pitch letters are bad, and then we have them talking to a jazz musician who's like, well, I seem to be doing okay with these pitch letters.
Yeah, I know that pitch.
So I'm just saying this conversation is useful to have so that people can kind of fortify themselves against, like, maybe in this context, the way this person is fine.
Pitch letters are bad when you're teaching students to decipher the code in order to learn to play an instrument, and then only after the fact are they learning to audiate. And that was me. But I was audiating all along, just didn't know, and I wasn't being taught to, right? So it's like there's a undercurrent of, like, because I had, good musical experiences early in life, that I could make those, connections, and I could play in tune better than most of my...
well, and that's why rote learning is so important instrumentally, because... I get a lot of students who, they come to me for piano or guitar lessons. They don't necessarily want to come to lessons to sing. And even though I know singing is going to be, a major part of bringing their audiation to where it needs to be, they want to play their instrument. So, essentially, what are you going to do? You're going to teach them to play songs by rote. And by rote on the piano is a pure dream. By rote on the guitar is a little more difficult because you don't share an instrument with the student. But if you just do by rote if you can, right? You don't need the pitch letter names. So there's other issues that come up. Like, even we recently spoke to the creators of the audiate guitar method, and they use names for chords, right? E minor, A minor, and on a guitar, you have to do that. Like, even if you're using movable do with a law bass minor, if you don't teach them the actual names of the chords they're learning, it'll cause a massive amount of confusion. You got to use that, but you don't rely on that. You still
this is something I still got to parse out for myself, like the balance between the two, because I don't teach instrumentally. I just teach in the ear and the body and the mind. That's all I. Yeah.
And again, to bring this back to our initial discussion, the whole reason I discovered this, I don't think I discovered it. A lot of people have been playing a song in different tonalities, but I really discovered on the piano and the guitar, if you just keep the thing in parallel tonality, boom, they learn the song so fast, and they seem to they know what you're talking about.
Yep.
So it's cool. And it doesn't take long. Like, I'm talking about, this could take 30 seconds over a course of 3 lessons to teach someone how to do. Because I'm already teaching them to play the song in major or minor. And then just 30 seconds, I'm like, hey, was that the new one or was that the old one? And then boom, they can tell you. Like, that seems like a good use of time to me.
Yeah. These making comparisons and how tonally you can understand a comparison. How about if we just change a function? Mary had a little amp, something other than dominant, right? Change, right? Making these comparisons so that you're staying in the same tonality, but instead of dominant, you just play something else that'll substitute.
And I think it's so useful to use a familiar song to do this, because so if I was going to go Mary Had a Little Lamb, instead of 1 and 5, use something, like 1 and the 7 chord from Mixolydian, so 1 and flat 7. I would think of it in major. The question is, why is that useful to do when a familiar song? It's because the thing just stands out. If you can hear the original one, it's just like, whoa, that's not the same. And in my mind, the memory is now being attached to something you're familiar with, rather than starting a new song. Not that you don't want to teach more songs.
But there you're altering the tonality and the function, of course. But you could also do.
Was that 2?
You audiated as 2 because it's a 4 chord.
Oh, yeah.
And 4 chords
I heard it as 2 for a sec.
Yeah, sure, you could.
You play enough jazz, every 4 is a 2.
Four and two are synonymous
I
to
feel
you.
like that's the difference between like Bach and jazz. In Bach, there's more 4s than 2s. In jazz, there's more 2s than 4s. But they both use the other ones.
Yeah. All right, that's great. This is a good conversation.
It's cool. It's interesting. Yeah, and then there's this possibility of not stopping at major and minor. There are so
Yep.
you can make the songs. What's cool for major and minor? We'll wrap up with this. Is that with major and minor, you can teach them to make this discrimination with just the melody. So if they're playing a piano and you taught them by rote, they can play it themselves. And I often will have students. Okay, now you do the quiz with me. Let's see if your music teacher can hear the difference between the two of these things. They love it. But
Yeah.
when you start, certain songs can't be easily changed into like mixolydian from major because it might not have the tone that is actually required to make that difference. So what you can do is you start
Yep.
using the
Yep.
functions to do that.
Yep. It brings me to something else, and then we'll stop for real.
Okay, what's the something else?
It's uh, uh, old Joe Clark,
Oh, old Joe Clark. Yeah, who knows what tonality this is in? Some people played in mixolydian.
right? Right? What tonality is that?
Was that major with te or is it mixolydian? Right? We don't know.
Exactly. We don't know.
Yeah.
Same as Twinkle Twinkle. What is it? I played the wrong functions on it, but yeah. So, people fight about, hey, well, that's a mixolydian song. It's got that flat 7. And that's just a blues chord. If it's 5-1. Right? And it's played both ways. You listen to the old guitar players in the Appalachians, and they'll play it. They'll play it one way and they'll play it another way. Predominantly, it is mixolydian.
Yeah. Okay.
I think, but that's only if you do.
But see, like this
and instead of
this is where
it doesn't matter what the melody is.
Yeah.
It matters what the function is. That's
what I'm saying is that I think the importance of the harmonic learning sequence really becomes apparent when if you can label these functions by ear and also play them on the piano if you're an instrumentalist, you can actually stop worrying about what the tonality is, because some of these songs, it's not useful to think about it. Well, now I'm in major, now I'm in mixo, now I'm in Dorian. Now it's just like there is this function happening now.
Yeah, it's a blues 1. It's a 1-7, and it's not 5-4 because it doesn't go to 4. It doesn't sound like it's going to go to 4, and it's not, because there's a B flat in the key of C that it's now mixolydian because there's something in the melody. It's people that don't understand the blues that would think that it's mixolydian.
It's
only mixolydian if there's a 7 chord.
Yeah. I mean, but there's also yesterday a student of mine showed me a song. He watched the Motley Crue documentary. I think it's called Dirt. But he learned how to play the song, and it's a C, and then the bass note walks down to a B, so it's like C major 7 or E minor, however you want to think about it. But it's like C major 7, C7 to F, right? And a lot of people, when they're first getting into studying harmony and tonalities, they think that the C7 means they're in the key of F now, the keyality of F. That's not what that means. You just went to the 4 chord. Which is a secondary dominant. But like same thing happens in tonalities. And you've been talking about this since I've known you. It's like just because we played te in major, we have not left major. This is not necessarily mixolydian. So this often messes with people because sometimes people's definition of a tonality is if I play do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and do is the resting tone, then that's all that's allowed in major, right? And that's totally not true.
Of course.
Yeah. But I think it's worth saying because I think it's often forgotten. I think in the background, that's someone's theoretical idea of a tonality is there's 7 tones. And if I make functions out of these tones, then I'm in the tone. Not necessarily. Yeah.
Well, fodder for more episodes to come.
Okie dokie. That's fun.
All right. Thank you.